Welcome to another Saturday workshop at the Anti-Fragility Health Clinic. My name is Charles Sinai, the CEO of Anti-Fragility Health. So today, I wanted to do a review of the conversations we've had this week with Dr. Johnson, but I'm going to go into more particular details with regard to the interventions that we use to address the underlying issues. So there were two big topics we discussed this week, actually three, but the third one is actually part of the second. So there are two big issues that happen in life. We're either asleep or we're awake. And so we want to discuss why we sleep and why are we awake. The second question of why we're awake is a very deeply philosophical one. Why are we awake and why do we sleep? So we tend to be in either state. Either we're asleep or we're awake. So let's talk about sleep. And I've shared the material. Vincent, can you give them the material? We've shared the material online so we can look at sleep in a lot of detail. Because most people, except when you're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, most people don't sleep well. So let's look at sleep. So you're supposed to sleep for 8 hours every 24-hour cycle, 8 hours every night. And in the 8-hour cycle, we have 90-minute cycles in each of the 8 hours. There are about 4 to 5 90-minute cycles. And those 90-minute cycles take us into different stages of sleep. So it is very important that we understand the sleep cycle and understand what's happening as we sleep. So let's look at that sleep cycle and understand, and we're going to look at the overall cycle itself, and we will be able to get a sense of what's actually happening within the sleep cycle, right? So there is the period of being awake, then we go into REM, then we go into deeper levels of sleep. So if you look at in each 90-minute cycle, we're actually in very deep state of N3 sleep for about 30, 40 minutes. The rest of the times, we are waving up and back. And it's really very important that we understand that. And so the context of insomnia, and what's insomnia? Insomnia is people who find it difficult to go to sleep. So there are three issues with insomnia. Finding it difficult to go to sleep, finding it difficult to go back to sleep if you wake up to go pee, and finding it difficult to stay asleep for the duration of sleep that's required. So a lot of people suffer from insomnia. And insomnia is a disturbance of your sleep cycle. And therefore, it's going to cause a lot of problems, ultimately, with sleep. So let's go and look at a couple of diagrams that I have shared. I want to take you through this first one because it begins to talk about cortisol and melanin. So it's very interesting because cortisol is what keeps us awake, and melanin is what really keeps us asleep. So when you look at the graph, the red line is the body temperature, and you can see that when we are asleep, our body temperature dips, but it's still within the temperature regulated range. You see that cortisol starts very high when we're awake, and we're going to show you that in some more detail. Cortisol is a hormone released from the adrenals. Cortisol is high, it falls during the day, and then when we are sleeping, cortisol begins to rise again, and then we wake up because it's really the cortisol rising that wakes us up, and we wake up, then we have what we call the cortisol awakening response. And that goes up, and that's really what wakes us up, and we feel refreshed after the sleep, and then it begins to drop to its normal cycle again. But interestingly, look at melatonin. If you look at the melatonin cycle, it's flat when we're awake, and then at night it begins to rise. So this is the normal hormonal cycle for awakeness and for sleep. Most people have a disrupted hormone cycle for cortisol and for melatonin. And how do you find that? You find out commonly from the fact that you can't sleep, you have insomnia, and for people who need to drink coffee in the morning to be awake, right? If you wake up and you don't feel like you slept well, it means your cortisol level is not at a level that makes you feel awake. So it's really important. People have those signals already. If you ignore them, this is really critical signals for good health, right? And so we know that melatonin, right, reduces with aging, right? That's why babies sleep very well, and most of us cannot sleep well, especially women once they have children. Sleep gets compromised because their overall hormonal architecture is challenged. And so sleep becomes a very difficult issue. And that's why we supplement with melatonin, either liposomal or capsules, right? Supplementing with melatonin is very important. And everyone has to find how much they need through experimentation. So I started with 3 milligrams of melatonin, and I will sleep at 8:30, and potentially I'll wake up at 3 a.m. Then I increased it to 6 milligrams plus magnesium, and it takes me to 4:30 a.m., which is approximately about 8 hours of sleep. So you find your level, and some nights I might wake up at 3 a.m., and I might take another 3 milligrams of melatonin to give me enough sleep till 5 p.m. So it's important. Dr. Johnson takes 27 milligrams, and I know we have a couple of our staff who take about 40 milligrams to stay asleep. So it's really important that, and melatonin is a natural product that supports the sleep cycle. So we do not recommend medications to support your sleep. So having enough sleep is really critical. So let's just talk about that in some more detail. So let's turn to the next slide, and let's talk about, there are a couple of slides back. I'll show you the slide. So let's look at what I'll call our circadian rhythm. What's our circadian rhythm? It's really what we've been talking about. It's our sleep-wake cycle. That's how God created the architecture. And what is the trigger to our system to be awake? Number one is the melatonin, right? Depletion, and secondly, the cortisol rising. But the other trigger to our overall metabolism is sunlight and food. That's why it's very dangerous. When you go gambling in Vegas, they put you in this kind of lighting, and you never see the sun, and they don't show you the time. So they actually control your circadian rhythm. You know, most people who go gambling in Vegas forget they have to sleep. And the reason is because the lighting is very deceptive to the brain to think that it is daylight. So they use daylight, which I've almost caught here, a really high intensity light that mimics daylight. And therefore, if you stay in this kind of lighting, you'll find it very difficult to sleep. That's why they say your phone and your computer or your laptop should not, or television should not be in the room, because the blue light, which is very intensive light, is light that disrupts sleep. So let's look at this circadian rhythm. So let's start with, say, noon. When we look at noontime, right, you find out that your best coordination is at 2:30. And your fastest reaction time is at 3:30. And your best cardiovascular efficiency and muscle strength is at 5 p.m. Then we get to 6 p.m. Your highest blood pressure is at 8:30. And at 7 p.m. is your highest body temperature. And then at 9 p.m., which is really your sleep time, that's when melatonin secretion begins. So if I go to bed at 8:30, typically I fall asleep around 9:30, because I rest, I'm doing a lot of thinking and planning, and sometimes around 9, but I take the added melatonin plus the one that my body produces, and typically around 9 o'clock I will fall asleep. It's really important that you fall asleep around then, because if you prolong falling asleep later than 9 p.m., you suffer some consequences for not sleeping when the sun is down. It is really important you understand that, because between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m., we have 9 hours. And your sleep needs to happen within those 9 hours until the sun rises. If you sleep beyond the sun rises, you're already impacting the overall circadian rhythm. So around 10:30, that's why you tell children to go to the bathroom before they go to sleep. The bowel movements are suppressed. But for most of us, as we're growing older, we wake up to go pee sometimes because we drink beer or we drink wine and we drink a lot of water at night. But bowel movements are typically suppressed. That's why you don't poo, you don't do number 2 at night. You tend to do it in the morning or in the evening, not during the night. Then there's midnight, and 2 a.m. is the deepest period when you're asleep. It's your deepest sleep. And around 4:30 a.m. is your lowest temperature. We know that most heart attacks, almost 80%, happen between 4:30 a.m. and 6 a.m. And if you notice, that's when the body has the lowest body temperature, but also the blood pressure, it begins to rise. And so most heart attacks happen around that morning period. Then you see that around 7:30 a.m. melatonin secretion stops, and typically most people go to the bathroom after they wake up. The body has cleansed itself, and then also around 9 a.m. there's the highest testosterone secretion. So we're just taking you through the biological rhythm, what we call the circadian rhythm. We're going to talk some more about that later as we look at the sleep-wakeful period. So it's the same thing on the next slide that I did provide. But let's look at this slide and look at the issue of sleep inertia, right? What is sleep inertia? So if you don't sleep well, right? So just look for that, it's somewhere in your slides. So sleep inertia, when you don't sleep well, so look at the typical, what we call the cognitive performance score, right? So when you wake up, you are actually at the highest, and then in the afternoon there's a bit of a slump, and then there's high, and then it starts dropping. So if you don't sleep, if you're sleep deprived, your cognitive performance actually drops. So that's why students who say, I want to study all night to pass the exam, typically don't do very well in the exam. So missing your sleep reduces your cognitive performance. So sleep deprivation has a very, very bad impact on us. And so we use a lot of sleep support things. So let me talk about. So melatonin, and Vincent, bring me magnesium. Magnesium is a very, very important mineral for you to take every day. It's almost as important as vitamin D, because the body doesn't store magnesium. So every day you need to take it, because it really controls blood pressure, it controls your muscle relaxation, and it's really helpful for you to relax and to be able to sleep. So on top of melatonin, we take the magnesium chelate or the magnesium malate. Yeah, so we actually do either the magnesium, the chelate, or we do the malate, which is the best form of magnesium that the body can absorb very well. So it's really important that you take magnesium daily plus the melatonin and it is recommended for a lot of people that you take 1 tablet of magnesium in the morning and 2 at night when you go to sleep. I don't take magnesium in the morning because I'm very awake in the morning. I sleep well. But before I go to bed, I take 2 magnesium plus my melatonin so that I can actually have a very restful sleep, right? Some people, when they sleep, they have cramps, and some patients we have helped and we have put them on magnesium plus melatonin, and those cramps are reduced when they go to bed at night. So really, sleep and the architecture of sleep is very important, that we pay attention to it as much as we pay on being awake. So let's talk about being awake. The question I asked Dr. Johnson in our conversations was, why are we awake? We know why we sleep, right? That's when the body resets, builds memory, cleans, does all the excretion. That's why when you wake up in the morning, you have a very long pee, and that's the pee we always want for testing. It's the right pee. It comes from all the stuff that happens overnight. Number 2, also, it's a good one in the morning, and all the metabolism and repair and restoring of memories and reset of all our biosystems occurs during sleep. When we wake up, right, we now go into where our basal metabolic rate increases, right? If you've done our body composition analysis, or you've done some body composition analysis, it gives you your basal metabolic rate and your active metabolic rate. So the basal metabolic rate is the energy consumption when at rest, which would include sleep, and your active metabolic rate is the energy required to keep you awake. So it's almost like the ignition of a car starting the engine. That's what cortisol does. It starts this engine. Now the engine is running to keep us awake. That engine goes into hibernation to keep us asleep. It's not that the engine is not running, but the engine goes into a different mode to keep us asleep, and that engine has to be restarted for us to wake up. So the question is, why are we awake? So it's a deeply philosophical question. And for people who have explored Buddhism or Christianity, we are awake to fulfill our purpose. Most people don't have purpose. What is the point of your life? A great Buddhist monk told me, what is the great haku of life? The big questions of life are around, who am I? Where am I going? And what do I want? Those questions drive purpose. And once you find purpose, then you will understand why it is important to live long and have a healthy life, because it requires that for you to achieve your purpose. And so, being awake for us, it is very important that you address what we call the 4 big stresses of life. And what are the 4 big stresses of life? You'll find out that in the last slide that I have given you, the 4 big stresses. So we're going to talk about the 4 big stresses of life. The things that we call stress the silent killer. And so I'm going to walk through and show you. Do they have copies, or make them copies?
No, they do. The last one.
The last page. Should be on the last page. Or make them copies. Make them copy if they don't have.
Yeah.
So the 4 big stresses. So let's walk through the 4 big stresses. I already spoke about one, the circadian disruption. What's the circadian disruption? The big issue with circadian disruption has to do with sleep. Most people don't have a problem being awake. Most people have a problem being asleep. Very few people, have a problem being awake or sleeping too much. Most people have a problem not being able to sleep. So that is the biggest issue in what we call the circadian disruption. And typically, it's people who have sleep issues, right? They drink too much coffee. That's why coffee is not really recommended at night, because you cannot sleep. Or people who have pain, If you have pain, it's going to affect your sleep, or you have sleep apnea. A lot of men and women have sleep apnea, a lot of snoring, and therefore they cannot actually rest properly. And so you need to address the sleep apnea issues. Sleep apnea is actually a big indication for cardiometabolic issues. And most people who have sleep apnea actually have heart issues or diabetes. So it's a very, very important indicator if you have sleep apnea to address it. And what is sleep apnea? Sleep apnea is people who do not breathe regularly when they sleep. So for a couple of minutes or seconds, they will stop breathing, then their body will catch up again with the breathing. And so if you have a partner or somebody who has that problem, you need to fix it very quickly because it's a strong indicator of big cardiometabolic issues coming down the line. So that was number one, circadian disruption, right? Or people who work at night. Most nurses who work at night have bad health. Or when you fly to Korea or Vietnam or wherever, that takes 15 to 20 hours. Or daylight savings. You know what has happened in the last week? As we have gone an hour forward, you find out that it disrupts a lot of things, your sleep patterns, your wake patterns, and also the daylight patterns, right? That's affecting and causing some circadian disruptions. So let's go to the second area of stress, which is what we call our inflammatory signals. The whole gut issue is the source of inflammation. And these inflammatory signals are really critical that we address them. And the standard way to address our inflammatory signals every day is actually to do three things. Number one, you must take probiotics. Probiotics create the diversity balance in the gut. And as we know, the gut is the primary inflammatory source because that's where all the signals for accepting air, water, and food quality is addressed. And the balance of the bacteria, what we call the microbiome, is a critical component for managing the inflammatory signals. Number two is to have probiotics, prebiotics, which is fiber, right? Most people don't eat fruit or vegetables. They create a smoothie. That does not give you good fiber. You need to eat the vegetable the way God made it, not the way human beings have designed to crush it and drink as a drink. You destroy all the fiber. You're still getting the nutrients, but you're not getting the fiber. And what's the job of fiber? The good bacteria feeds on fiber and therefore proliferate. So if you do not retain good fiber, then the good bacteria does not have anything to feed on, therefore they can multiply and therefore support the balance between good bacteria and bad bacteria, which we're supplementing good bacteria with the probiotics we're taking. So the fiber probiotic balance is really important for managing the inflammatory signals. Most Americans suffer from digestive disorders, bloating, gas, pain during doing number two, and just lots of issues, whether it's constipation or diarrhea. It's a big, big challenge because of the inflammatory. And if you don't take care of it, those inflammation leads to a lot of big illnesses that we study upstairs in clinical research, like Crohn's. Crohn's disease is a precursor to colorectal cancer. So there's a lot of cancer of the gut when people don't take care of the inflammatory signals. Inflammation is a response by the body to say something is wrong. So if you have diarrhea and constipation and you don't take care of it, it leads to a lot of illnesses of the gut culminating in cancer, which is very dangerous. So it is important that you take your daily probiotics and you take your fiber. Very, very important. And we have one other big product here that I take every day. I take it as my chocolate drink in the morning, which is the GI Replenish. It is important, as it says, to support the management of compromised gut function and digestive disorders, including malabsorption. Most of us with age have issues of malabsorption. What is malabsorption? When the tight junctions of the large and small intestines are loose because of infections and other inflammatory signals, then the body is not absorbing nutrients appropriately. So ensuring that those junctions are tight and are only accepting nutrients that have to pass through the walls is a critical issue. So we recommend this as prevention. It is important because it contains all the amino acids that will keep the lining of the gut with gut integrity and therefore reducing the inflammatory signals. So let's go back to the stress architecture. So we've spoken about sleep, we've spoken about inflammation, and as we know, with COVID-19 and the flu season, if you have high inflammatory signals, then COVID loves you. So reducing your inflammatory signals is really important because what does inflammation signal to invading parasites? That's bacteria and viruses, that we have a compromised cellular architecture for them to attack. So they land on those inflamed cells and they have easy entry. And that's why, because most people who have chronic illness have chronic inflammation. Like if you have Alzheimer's, if you have cancer, if you have diabetes, if you have arthritis, you already have a compromised chronic inflammation. And therefore, you are vulnerable for bacteria and virus attack because of this persistent stress in your system. Let's look at the next one, which is the glycemic dysregulation. What is the glycemic dysregulation? It is our ability to manage our blood sugar. So most people say they do very well, but we have found from research that we want to have this management of blood sugar to be very steady. So most anti-aging experts are recommending that you actually wear a glucometer to measure your sugar management because of the stress. We know glycemic dysregulation is a critical source of chronic illness. And actually, it is one of the reasons why people die early. And therefore, managing that sugar balance is critical. So it's not just the measurement. And so we recommend that you take berberine with each meal because it then allows you to actually manage your sugar in the blood appropriately. So the measurement and the management are two critical issues. And that's why you must also exercise, because exercise is the way in which the body, the muscles, extract sugar out of the blood so they can use it for energy production. So managing blood sugar, just being within the range is not good enough. We want to make sure that your body is managing it really, really flat. The modern research has shown that fluctuations of sugar in the blood is a critical issue for aging and for chronic illness. So the issues of when you have low fiber, that's the other reason why you want high fiber, because it means that the good bacteria is going to make sure that they regulate the amount of sugar entering the bloodstream. You also want to reduce the glycemic index of the food that you eat. So if you're going to eat starches, that's why we talk about resistant starch. What's the glycemic index? Dr. Johnson this week exposed us to some new findings that if you boil rice, put it in the fridge, and heat it the next day, it actually turns it into resistant starch. So if you love rice as I do, you need to look for ways, the same thing with potatoes, to actually turn them into resistant starch. And what's a resistant starch? It's a starch that's not easily converted to sugar. So we can use a lot of it appropriately for energy without it overwhelming the bloodstream. So we have some tests that we can do to actually show how your body manages the sugar profile. So I've spoken about 3 of the stresses: the circadian disruption, the inflammatory signals, and the glycemic dysregulation. So let's talk about the 4th one, which is the one that most of us recognize as stress, which is the perceived stress. And as Dr. Johnson describes it, the perceived stress is not really about what happened, right? The election is going on. What is stressful about the election going on is how I respond to it. That's what causes stress. It is not what is going on. What is going on is life going on. But how I respond to what is going on is what causes stress for me. And so, how am I responding to this? I respond by ignoring most of the information that's coming and putting myself in a positive mode. And how do I put myself in a positive mode? I choose to have faith rather than have fear, so that I don't stress myself and worry, because worrying does not change the future, but taking action does change the future. So I support the fact that elections happen in a democracy, but it is also important that we count the votes and that there's no fraud. And if the winner emerges fairly and square, then we would support that winner and accept the fact that we did not fail. So I'm not stressing about the issue because ultimately God's will happen. So perceived stress is a challenging issue because some of it is driven by our response, but some of it is also driven by the balance of these hormones that you see on the chart I've given you. And what are they? DHEA, which is the balance to cortisol, right? It's important. I used to take 5 milligrams of DHEA, and Dr. Johnson told me I needed 50 milligrams a day. So I started taking 50 milligrams a day, and I can sense a difference, that my irritability has gone down. Really important. Also, there's pregnenolone, which is a supplement that we also offer. And then there's serotonin, dopamine, GABA, and glutamate. So these are all hormones that are important. We have GABA. So if you're somebody who's highly excitable, it's important you take GABA so you can reduce your anxiety and your stress and make sure that you manage it. These 4 stresses are really the hidden killers of today's life. Most people say, I am fine, I'm healthy, but most of us suffer from these 4 stresses. And so it is important that you get the right advice and that you're doing the right things to actually address those stresses so you can actually have a really balanced life. So today what we've tried to do is to cover the week conversations with Dr. Johnson. On Tuesday, we discussed sleep, and we've covered sleep and some of the supplements that support sleep. On Wednesday, we covered being awake. We've looked at the supplements that cover that. We have quite a lot of them here. We have the RDA, which is the recommended daily allowance. We have that in liquid, a liposomal liquid from Quicksilver, which will be 1 spoon a day. We have the core minerals. This is the standard stuff that you must be taking every day. There is no option. You must take this every day, especially the omega-3s. Why? Because most of the food we eat has mostly omega-6. And therefore, the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 must be achieved for you to have the right fats and oils for the brain and other parts. Vitamin D, I take this therapeutic dose every day for a week, and then I'm off a week. And we have the cold pressed flaxseed oil omega-3 for people who are vegetarians. And we also have a powder form here, Life Core, which will give you the full RDA in the powder form. So it is important that when you're awake, that the body gets the right amount of nutrients that the body needs. How are you going to find out whether you are getting the right amount of nutrients? You must do your blood test, you must do your urine test, and you must do your stool test. Why? The stool test is going to tell us whether you have the bacterial diversity required for managing the inflammation architecture and the digestive tract. Very, very important test, because most people find out too late that they already have colorectal cancer. So if you haven't done a colonoscopy, you must do a stool test. It's really important, because if we find blood and polyps in that stool, then we will recommend you quickly to go do a colonoscopy so we can find out whether you're developing colorectal cancer. Very, very important. If you haven't done it, you must do it if you're above 40 years old. The second test or set of tests is your urine test, which is going to tell us the hormones, your sex hormones, cortisol, DHEA, all of that. We need to know what those hormonal levels are, so you know what is the appropriate therapeutic amounts that you need to take to achieve what we call optimal nutrition. Your urine test, the second one, will tell us the amount of toxicity. Doesn't matter how healthy you are, if you have a lot of toxicity, it's going to compromise your health and you're going to get cancer. It's very clear. You need to detox to reduce that toxicity. And where does toxicity come from? From the air, from the water, from the food, and from the chemicals that we put on our body. So it's really important that you check those toxicity. And lastly, the blood tests, or second to last, the blood test that would tell us your lipid panel, which are the early signals of chronic illness. Your triglycerides, HDL, LDL, will give us clear signals. Inflammatory signals, C-reactive protein, which are big signals of what's going on with creatinine, with your liver and your kidney. We'll also look at your metabolic, your sugar management, and we'll also look at your overall blood count. But last and not the least, we also ask that you do your genetic test. You want to understand what you inherited so that you know what to prevent. Because sometimes we don't know whether we were adopted, right? There's no evidence if you don't test. Some of my friends have found out some very interesting information that their fathers were not really their fathers. So if you really want to know your history, I'm not saying find out whether your parents are your parents. You want to find out what you inherited. It's really important, because you may inherit the Alzheimer's gene and you're not aware, and you have to pay attention, because those are very important things, especially for menopausal women, to have the clear understanding whether I have the gene or not, and therefore what the precautions are. So very important when you're awake. We've spoken about the stress architecture and how you manage that, and that's where we'll end our conversation today. So thank you for joining the workshop, and hope to see you again next week. Thank you.